John chapter 11. That's where we left off last week in our journey through the Gospel of John. We've been looking at, for the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at the story of Lazarus. Better to say the account of Lazarus. Sometimes when we say story, it sounds like there are characters involved and there was a writing of the script. The only script that was written is the sovereignty of God, and we looked at that, how God is sovereign. And whenever some people say God's late, He's right on time. He moves when He wants to move, and He ordained this event where Lazarus would die. That's right. Matter of fact, Jesus said when Lazarus was just sick that this was to glorify God. And then when Jesus spoke to the Father, and also whenever He mentioned to the disciples that it's good that I wasn't there in order to heal him, so that you could see God was going to glorify the Son with him through this event. And so it's through the sovereignty of God that Lazarus was both dead and resurrected. And we left off last week and in verse 45, and we're going to go back and capture a little bit from there. But I want us to look at three things this morning. Now, you know I'm not normally one who does as many preachers, and I'm not knocking it, but one of the preachers will say, well, we're going to look at these 3 or 4 things today, and they all start with the same letter. Yeah, we're doing that today. I want us to keep in mind 3 things and observe 3 categories of people. We're going to encounter 3 categories of people this morning. The 3 categories are the privileged. That's the wealthy, the elite. These are Sadducees who had power, possessions, and were driven by their possessions and pleasures and to maintain power. They were ambitious for power and pleasures and wealth. And these are the privileged. Also, we're going to come across the prestigious. Those are the ones who look to be admired, the esteemed. The Pharisees were one who not necessarily had as much wealth as the Sadducees. The Sadducees were really the wealthy ones. They were the aristocrats among the Jews. Pharisees were not doing bad financially, but they actually were more of the people's champions. The Pharisees were ones that claimed to have represented the people, and to a great extent, the people related more to the Pharisees. And so the Pharisees really kind of had the feel of the people, and they were respected, they were esteemed, and that was their big deal. The Pharisees really wanted to be seen as though they were of great importance and value. And so those were the ones who had the people's respect, reverence, admiration. They were the righteous one with the big capital bold print on being right. It was important that they were right, and they did not want to be right. So a lot of pride and a lot of ego. Not that the Sadducees did not have pride and ego, but they were really those that really focused on money and wealth. Now, you could say, is that really what they were focused on? Just keep in mind, Pharisees and Sadducees were not organizations or positions established by God. They were established by men. So anytime man goes around trying to establish positions, you will see that it's not rooted in God, and it won't reflect godly character. The third that we will look at today are the pious. Those are devout, sincere. They're content with necessities, not one to sacrifice needs for wants. See, it's not necessarily that they didn't have wants. It's not necessarily that a pious person isn't one who desires to have nice things. It's a pious person is not going to sacrifice what's needed for what's wanted. They know the difference. Pious persons has their priorities in order. So let's keep an eye out as we're going through the scriptures this morning, that we look and are able to identify, maybe do a little bit of what they normally tell us not to do, is to put people in categories. Let's do that a little bit this morning. 3 categories: privileged, the prestigious, and the pious. And I want us to do that as an opportunity as we encounter these various groups and these categories of people, that we say, where do I fit? Who am I? Now, Let's be honest. Let's be real. Right now, probably any of us are saying, well, I'm neither the prestigious, I'm not the privileged by any means, so I must be the pious. Well, let's just be careful before we get too quick to categorize ourselves, because I think we can find a reflection in any of those mirrors. How so? How could the privileged, we looked at as the Sadducees, the privileged are the wealthy, they're elite. Well, what is it about the wealthy and the elite? They were the ones who had desire for power, possessions, and pleasures. Can we really relate to that? Oh, I think so. I think so. It's just all about perspective. Getting the right perspective. We would look around in our lives and say, well, none of us are Sadducees. Or maybe we would look at some of us and say, well, you might be a Sadducee. I'm not prestigious nor privileged. I'm not privileged. I got to go work every day. I'm a blue collar. This is who I am. I'm not the luxurious. Well, let's think about what luxury is if you were to go to another country, let's say. If you were to go to some other countries, I'm going to tell you something. You wouldn't have to be there very long for you would feel like that almost everybody in the United States could fall into this privileged category. Well, for one, we live in a country that has a very strong welfare state. It does. You can hardly go hungry. I know that people go hungry, but there are a lot of people who are hungry and homeless by choice. That's just a reality. I've dealt with the homeless. I've dealt with those who are hungry, and I've come across very few that are literally hungry and very few that are homeless without a choice. Because there are shelters, there are places that will take it, but there's a lot of people that are homeless and hungry by choice in this country. You go to other countries, not so. Many countries, they are hungry and they are homeless, and there's nothing that they can do about it. Their government could care less. Now, sometimes people, I know this, sometimes people in this community, in the city of Alvin, as I've encountered, and I've went down and I've talked with them, prayed with them, I've brought them coffee, and I've brought them food, and I've talked to them, and it didn't take me long to figure out they don't want to go and fit into society, and so they're willing to pay the price. They don't want to conform to rules, and they don't want to conform to getting a job. Now, that's not everybody, but that's a lot. I'm just giving you the truth. That's a lot. But if people are willing to work, or they're willing to do what it takes to get the help, this country will help you. It will feed you. It will take care of you if you got a tooth that needs to be pulled. Do you know what I'm talking about? We're living in a privileged society. And in this privileged society, if you were to go somewhere where they are not privileged and they look and they'd say, you mean you drink sodas? Man, you must be rich. Well, I mean, we have sodas and we have cable TV and we have smartphones and we have these elaborate things and we smoke cigarettes. These are all rich man things to a lot of people. None of those things I just mentioned are necessities. These are our luxury things. The things that I know in this congregation, this fellowship, we spend money on luxury items. Any of those things I just mentioned, those are rich man stuff. They are. But we have a tendency to look at other people and judge by them. Well, maybe if I look at Steve and what he drives, or the kind of money that he makes or something, well, now I'm poor and I'm pious. No. Let's have a reality check. We need to take a good look at ourselves this morning and not looking at other people. Let's look at ourselves. So I think that any of us could possibly fit into this first category of the privileged. Really. We could. Also, the prestigious, surely no, none of us, our names aren't in the limelight. I mean, I'm not out there. I don't have my own television show. I don't have my own channel. I mean, okay, maybe I have my own Facebook page. Maybe I've got my own profile that's got my good side picture posted on. Okay, well, maybe. Maybe I can identify a little bit with the prestigious who want to be admired and esteemed. Can we relate to those? I think we can relate to them with the posts that we make and the pics that we look. As we go back and we look, how many likes do I have? Has anybody commented on my stuff? Hold on, let's not get real this morning. But the reality is, if we were to get real this morning, we'd realize that, we could fit in with the Pharisees who did everything to be seen of men, to be glorified, to be respected, and to be revered of men. That was their thing. Matter of fact, they had it going good till Jesus came on the scene. See, when Jesus came on the scene, he did not validate all that was so important for them to be validated. They did much to be seen of men, and he came along and he started knocking out all those platforms that they were standing on about how mighty they were. But we don't fit inside this category of Pharisees who, or maybe we do. Maybe we do things with the thought of how well it's going to be accepted by others. Anything that we do that is rooted in how well others view us, put us inside of this desire to be prestigious. Yeah, okay. Post, pics, clothes, purses, shoes, hair, nails, cars. The things that we buy, how many times do we buy things based on that fits the need? Yeah, it fits the need for you to be seen. Yeah, it might fit the need for others to be impressed with you in the car that you drive or the clothes that you wear or the things. How much we do. Hold on, Steve. Don't get in people's business. Hey, I ain't going to hold back. I'm going to tell you that we need to look in the scriptures as if it's a mirror so that we can get a reflection of who we are, so that we can be transformed by the renewing of our mind and know that we need to be changed in the way that we view things. We need to be realistic in how our flesh literally really is. Our flesh is an enemy to God. And our flesh can put us in any of those categories. We do not need to have a bank full of money to have a rich man's mentality and desiring the things of a rich man. We don't need to have our own TV program out there to have a desire for it. It's the same whether you got it or not. We need to be real. We need to let God fix the problem instead of ignoring problems based on how much they are manifest. These things is what I want us to keep an eye on as we're reading through the Scriptures. So let's get into the Scriptures. And in chapter 45, chapter 11, after Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead, it says in verse 45 of chapter 11, then many of the Jews who had come to Mary and had seen these things Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went away to the Pharisees and told them the things Jesus did. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered a council and said, what shall we do, for this man works many signs? If we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and nation. I want you to see what's happening right here. Somebody calls a meeting. Whenever something really big or bad happens, people call a meeting to talk about it. And so here is Jesus. He's already been a troublemaker in their eyes. But why is he a troublemaker? Because to them, he is a threat. A threat to what? Any of those categories we just talked about. He could be a threat to the financial well-being and the prestigious status of the aristocrats. He could be a threat to that. He could be a threat to those who would be won over to Jesus, and they would have those that would follow and admire Jesus and esteem him as the righteous one. And the Pharisees like, no, don't go, people. Constantly we read and the people were going over to Jesus, and this is what the Pharisees were constantly concerned about. But we see that up to this point, most of the interaction with Jesus and the religious rulers and leaders were the Pharisees. Well, those are the Pharisees who saw the people moving over to Jesus, and it was their interest first that was an issue. But what we're going to see today is that because of Jesus' fame and because of him raising Lazarus from the dead, more and more people were coming to follow Jesus, and that could affect either one of these two categories. So where they often disagree, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they agreed on one thing: Jesus is a problem. And so they come together, and the word that's used here is council in verse 47. It's literally the Greek word for Sanhedrin. And they said, what shall we do, for this man works many signs? This is the very word for miracle. They don't even deny that he raised Lazarus from the dead. That's not even an issue in here. They are acknowledging that he is doing miraculous things, but they are so blinded by their prestigious ambition and for their privileged status that they're not even seeing God in the midst of it because of their own blindness, because their own fleshly desires. They're rejecting him as the Son of God and saying, we got to do something to protect our interest. We would never do that, would we? Oh, people do it all the time. Poor people, rich people, ugly people, pretty people. People reject Jesus all the time because of their own desires. I see people rejecting God, refusing to walk with Jesus because they have a love interest who's not walking with Jesus. So they will actually leave the church for the bar scenes and the bed scene, because they would rather be satisfying their own desires to be with a person who's going to die, person who can't give them eternal life, just to be with somebody they sacrifice God. Yes, even the poor people, the rich people, the pretty people, the ugly people do that. That's all of us. That's all of us. And they said, in verse 48, if we let him alone like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. The transfer of custody with this controversial Jesus is about to take place. We're going to see that the Sadducees, amidst all their their privilege and their desire for wealth and satisfaction of their pleasures, one was the power, and they had the power in the Sanhedrin. And so having this power, you're going to see that it's actually the Sanhedrin, or the Sadducees of the Sanhedrin, that really kind of take it from here. As we're going in and we're getting up right near the end of Jesus' ministry, near the end of Jesus' life here on earth, the Sadducees kind of take the reins because they're the ones with the power to do something. They're the ones with the influence. And see, that power and influence that the Sadducees had, namely among the Sadducees were the chief priest. And the chief priest, we see as we continue through the gospel, and we'll continue all the way through the crucifixion, you'll see that it's this power and influence even Caiaphas has in political power to influence even Pilate, the Roman governor. And so we see that it's going to be these Sadducees and their power that kind of take custody and go forward with Jesus, because now Jesus is threatening them. See, the Sadducees were offended by Jesus, but they weren't nearly as offended as the Pharisees until now. Because see, the Pharisees, they wanted the admiration of the people. But as long as the admiration of the people were going to the Pharisees, but the money was still going in the temple, Sadducees are fine. They got what they want out of it. But see, if you lose the people, then you will lose both their esteem and their admiration of you, and you will eventually lose your ability to pick their pockets. And that's what the Sadducees did. But there is this referring to Rome coming and taking. And why would Rome come and do anything? Why does the Sanhedrin say, we got to do something about this Jesus, for Rome comes and takes our place and our nation? Well, it is true that they could have seen Jesus as one who the people could get behind and cause an uprising and rise up against Rome. Well, there's good reason for Rome to be on guard of that. They know the history of what we covered here a few weeks ago about those that rose up against the Greeks whenever the Greeks ruled over them, remember, and they were victorious, and they took back the temple, and they took back Jerusalem. And so the Jews are known for rebelling against that. You know, they'll fight against tyranny. There were other accounts also of rebellions. So they could be very concerned about a rebellion that would what? Cause them to lose their status or to lose their position. So here's the Sadducees saying, man, we got a good life. We got money. We got possessions. We're okay with Rome because Rome is okay with us. See, Rome was facilitating a lot of things for the Jews to continue being Jews and to continue to be wealthy Jews. There were a lot of wealthy Jews, and Rome was allowing that. They weren't just going and taking all of their gold and silver. They had gold and silver up in the temple. They do later on go and take it, but they had a lot, and they were just saying, hey, just pay us our hefty tax, and we'll let you continue to do business. Well, that's okay for the rich, right? We'll pay the tax. It's no problem. We just hit the people a little harder. It's all right. We got this covered. But now, if there was some kind of uprising, like if people were to follow Jesus and be a military, well, then they could lose everything because they're like, man, if we don't win, we lose our houses, we lose our... So for their own desire, they're rejecting Jesus. So we pick up in verse 49. And one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all. Well, let's why in the world did Caiaphas just tell them, you know nothing at all? Well, it kind of comes back to his prestigeness, or his privilege. As a privilege, he's used to being the one that's as the high priest. They were the ones that could say, hey, I can take care of this from here. You don't know what you're talking about. Let me speak. I think what's actually happening right here is something similar to what happens in Acts chapter 15. Peter says, hey, I got some credibility here concerning a big disagreement that was happening in Acts chapter 15 in the church. And Peter says, hey, I've got the credentials to speak. He says, I'm the one who was called by God to speak to the Gentiles. I believe that's what's happening right here with Caiaphas, because I think that even though they agreed that Jesus is a problem, we know from the scriptures that there were Pharisees, namely Nicodemus, who we read earlier in the Gospel of John, who had kind of spoke up for Jesus. There's probably some kind of dialogue that's happening in this dilemma of what should be done. But Caiaphas says, I know exactly what needs to be done. Y'all need to listen to me. He is this privileged one. But before we continue on, I want us to look at this privileged one. And why is this privileged and this prestigious categories of people, why is Jesus a threat to their way of life? So if you want to turn back just a few chapters or books to the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 10. Let's look at something right here. Considering the privileged in Mark chapter 10, we pick up in verse 17. In Mark chapter 10 and verse 17, now as he was, and it's Jesus, as he was going out on the road, one came running, knelt before him and asked him, good teacher, what shall I do that I might inherit eternal life? It's a good question. So Jesus said to him, why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is God. You know the commandments, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and your mother. And he answered and said to him, teacher, all these things I have kept from my youth. He's excited. He's like, oh man, I've got this. I've got this. And Jesus looked at him, loved him, and said to him, one thing you lack. Go your way, sell whatever you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come take up your cross and follow me. But he was sad at this word, this rich young ruler. He was sad at this word and went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. So here is one of the privileged one who had the money, who had many possessions, but he wasn't willing to give up his possessions. See, it's not that whenever you come to Jesus, he says you got to sell all that you have. He says you got to give up anything that is greater than me. Anything that is greater than me. If this man was concerned about something else, then Jesus would have said to that issue, one thing you lack, and address that. What Jesus was doing, he was looking in the rich man's heart, and he knew that this rich man, his love for money was greater than his love for God. And so this privilege was a threat. And so because of that, he rejected Jesus, because Jesus was saying, no one before me, nothing before me. And if we turn back to the prestigious in John chapter 12, we're going back to the Gospel of John. We're going to jump ahead. We'll be here probably next week or in the next couple of weeks. In John, this very same chapter, in verse 42, nevertheless, among the rulers many believed in him, but because of the Pharisees they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praises of men more than the praises of God. So there are some people who just desire for the pleasures or to be admired of men. Here's a category. Here's an example of that. Some people who will not stand for the principles of God in Scripture because it's not popular among society. Some people will not take a proper stand against the homosexuality. We're not coming back to this because we want to beat a dead horse. This is where society in our country has drawn the line. We didn't pick where we were going to take our stands. They reached into our obligation to God to walk in holiness, and they said, this is where the line is going to be. And so if we take our proper stance concerning homosexuality, well then society will reject us. But we want to be loved by society. We want to be accepted by our family and our friends. So if we were to say that homosexuality is wrong, well, we might lose that. And the same thing right here, because we want the prestige of being accepted and to be admired and to people to be loved. But the reality is that we must choose to walk with God, or we must choose to give up our own ambitions, desires for money and greed and acceptance, whatever it is that's in our life. Jesus says, as he says to the rich man ruler this morning, he says, one thing you lack. What is it? We should be able to identify that ourselves. So back in verse 49, and one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all. He is this high one amongst them. He's the high among the high ones. Nor do you consider, verse 50, nor do you consider that it is expedient, it's in our best interest, for us that one man should die for the people, and not that the whole nation should perish. I'm glad that that's the end of verse 50, and we start a new verse in verse 51. Now this he said, this is now John in his commentary. Now this he did not say on his own authority or his own power or even his own ability, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. That's the end of verse 51, and although there weren't verses in the original manuscript, I think it's appropriate it goes there, because I believe that John is saying that's all he prophesied about. He prophesied that Jesus should die. So basically, Caiaphas is saying, if Jesus is a threat to our way of life, then he must die, and it's better that he dies than we lose the nation. You know, that a great uprising comes and Rome destroys us all. We need to kill this guy. It's best for the people. It's best for our nation that he must die. Well, you know what? It was best for the nation. Not only for the nation, for all of us it was best, because it was God's plan that Jesus would die on the cross to show us that not only did he have the power over death, but he was ready and willing and loved us so much that he would pay the pen and the price and the debt that we all owed. Praise God that Jesus died on the cross. It was best for the nation, but not just for the nation, for all of us, and that's what we see. John enters in his commentary and says that he did not say this of his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. The next verse says, and not for the nation only. I believe this is John's commentary, but that's not all he died for. Not for the nation only, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. Trust me, that did not come from Caiaphas, that part. He was just proclaiming, he was prophesying of what God had intended all along. So let's look at two things: the nature and extent of Caiaphas' prophecy. The nature is not a spiritual gift. He was an ungodly man. So it wasn't the gift of the Spirit giving him prophecy. It was the sovereignty of God, and God did that in his sovereignty in many occasions. It wasn't the gift or discernment, but God's sovereignty. Consider Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. It was Pharaoh that was used as an instrument of God. Now, he was already rejecting God. Pharaoh already had a hard and evil heart. But God used that for his own good purpose. Talk about the sovereignty of God that we've been looking at. And so this was the ruler of Egypt. He does the same thing when Saul turns his heart against God. He's already hardened his heart against God, King Saul, whenever God actually starts using that and working that. Caiaphas also turned his heart against God, rejected God through the Son. And God still uses him to go ahead and make sure that the religious leaders would do what they were always going to do, that God always knew they were going to do, and he would use that evil for good. That's what he always does. That's why he's always promised that. And so here, we don't acknowledge that he was a prophet, that Caiaphas was a prophet, but he spoke a truth because God was facilitating that the time was almost at hand for Jesus to lay down his life. And the extent of the prophecy, I believe, was just that the people would die for the nation. John goes ahead and enlightens the rest of us, but not just for the nation, praise God. Not just for the nation, but for all of us. Verse 53, then from that day on, they plotted to put him to death. Therefore Jesus no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there into the country near the wilderness to a city called Ephraim, and there remained with his disciples. And the Passover, verse 55, and the Passover of the Jews was near. And many went from the country up to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. Of course they would. It's now coming up to the last week of Jesus' ministry before he dies. Here we are, and we're only on chapter 11 of John, going into chapter 12 here, about halfway through the book. But what does that tell you? Here we are looking at the last week, and here we are only halfway through the book, but we're fixing to move into the most critical pieces. And I'm grateful that God is going to give us so much time to look at this last week and what happens afterwards, after he resurrects. And I'm looking forward to the fact that he's going to be showing us so much and spend so much of this writing and this gospel in this last week and the days after. So I'm excited about that. I hope that you are. Verse 56, then they saw Jesus and spoke among themselves as they stood in the temple. Who's that? These are back to these religious leaders. What do you think? That he will not come to the feast? They're thinking, hey, we already made a point. They said, what did they say? They said that we are going to arrest him. This is what they said. And not for the nation only, in verse 53. From that day on, they plotted to put him to death. In verse 53, the previous chapter. They were ready to put him to death. So all they need now is to get him. And they say, well, won't he come to the feast? This is going to be our opportunity. Surely any good Jew, and he fancies himself as a good Jew, they're going to come into town for the Passover. So we're going to keep an eye out for him. Now both the chief priests and Pharisees had given a command that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it, that they might seize him. Now this is very interesting because we're going to see that as we got this whole amount of scripture that we're going to be covering, where they're going to have plenty of opportunity to seize him. But they don't. You can see the harmony of the Gospels if you were to look at a chronological Bible. And in this next week leading up to his death, there were many opportunities for the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the temple police to seize him. He's in the temple, he's hanging out. And they don't take it. Why? Because they feared the people. The people were seeing that many people are following him. So it's going to have to come down to what? They're going to sneak around and do it at night. You see how it's coming down to this? You see how they are having to go so far beyond just the natural means of doing something. And it reminds me about how I don't sin accidentally. I don't. Really, I don't. I mean, I don't just kind of say, oh my goodness, I wasn't paying attention and I sinned. No, what I've found is that when I sin, it's deliberate. What I also find is that if I'm even close to having a good, healthy relationship with God, and this is what I mean. If I'm in a somewhat of a healthy relationship with God, even close, then something starts happening inside of me, and I actually have to make efforts to follow through with something that goes against God. I have to ignore opportunities to escape the temptation. Yeah, I've had where I had a premeditated thing that I wanted to do. James says that he teaches about this progress, that every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and his ties. And he goes on, it's not just, wait, oops, I sinned. And so whenever this thing starts to work up in my own desire, something that's not of God, then if I'm in a healthy relationship with him, he gives me several opportunities out. And I have to pass on those opportunities. I have to go out of my way. We don't sin accidentally. Now here's the thing. We can get so cold and callous to God that we don't even recognize the ways out anymore. And we're just sinning now freely. Oh man, I hope we're not in that state. That's a state that you should be challenging, looking and seeing if you're even among those who are believers. If you are even a follower of Jesus. But hopefully, the Holy Spirit begins to convict you, and that it's actually difficult for you to go against the Spirit of God in you. Can you relate to that? If not, God wants you to be able to relate to that. Chapter 12, verse 1. Then, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany. Y'all remember Bethany? That was the beginning of chapter 11. Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper. That's a good thing to do. When somebody comes into town that raised you from the dead, get your sister to cook something, And they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary, one of the sisters, took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard and anointed the feet of Jesus, wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, that's one, why, he said this, why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? Basically, 300 denarii is a year's wages. This was some high dollar oil. This is not some low shelf stuff. This was a high shelf stuff that Mary had put away. And she came, it's something that valuable is only for something that normally would be to anoint somebody's body that had died. And I heard one commentator saying, I could just see Lazarus in the room, said, well, you still got that? Why did you not anoint my body with that stuff? I'm your brother, or whatever. Well, this tells you that actually this family had some wealth. For one, this was a place where you hosted people, and you could throw a feast like this, and they had this just on reserve like this. Well, the reality is maybe they had so much of it they had used some on Lazarus and still had some more. But this was precious. This was of great value. This family is obviously not poor. But yet I think they were good Christians. Maybe you don't got to be poor to be a Christian. Maybe it has to do more with what's in their heart. Let's continue. Judas, he was the privileged one. When we look at, let's try to put some folks in categories right here. Judas is the privileged one. It was about the wealth for him because look, it says it right here that it says, why, he asked, why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? This he said, not that he cared for the poor. So let's get right to the reality. He didn't have a heart for the poor people, but because he was a thief. That's right. Oh, those are the Sadducees. Those were the privileged who felt like they were entitled to something that did not belong to them. Oh yeah, this is the Sadducees. This is the privileged. Judas belongs in that category right there. It's actually him that makes a deal with the chief priests, with the privileged ones, for the 30 pieces of silver in exchange for Jesus. Yeah, he was a privileged one. And he says, why wasn't this given to the poor? But he didn't not care for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money bag and he used to take what was put in it. Now, wait a second. Remember a few weeks ago, Joe was using the illustration, would you follow a pastor or a leader of a ministry that had someone that was the secretary of treasury, someone who handled the money, and yet the pastor knew that person was stealing from the offering box? Would you even go and associate with that preacher or that pastor? Not if he knew. You think Jesus didn't know? Jesus knew this guy was taken from the offering plate. But Jesus also knew that just like Caiaphas prophesied, just like everything that pointed to this, Jesus was going to die. He was going to be betrayed. All this fell within the sovereignty of God. And God even used the hardness of Judas's heart in rejecting God inside to use that to his own good, to our good. I like that if you read this same account over in Mark chapter 14, you see this same account. You see that the disciples also say the same thing. We were talking about this not too long ago. I think it was Marvin that mentioned Judas was probably kind of the one that was saying this, and the other disciples, yeah, because Judas is the one who's mentioned actually solely right here. But the scriptures say that actually the others were doing this. Maybe the other disciples who weren't taking from it still maybe had this kind of Pharisee-type attitude towards this act of love from Mary. Maybe they had their own little justification of why this shouldn't be happening, but for some reason, they knew better than Jesus, who was not correcting her. Matter of fact, this is what Jesus says. Let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you have with you always, but me you do not have always. He doesn't correct Mary. Matter of fact, he says she's doing the right thing. She's doing the right thing. So Mary actually falls in the category of the pious. What is the pious? Devout, sincere, content with necessities, not one to sacrifice needs for wants. See, you could have sold that to feed the poor, or you could have sold that to get her a new dress, outfit, and shoes, and a purse to match. But no, she wasn't going to sacrifice wants for what was needed, and what was needed is for God, Jesus, to be highest priority, even over your money, your wealth. And Mary shows this. So you don't have to be poor to be pious. Matter of fact, if you have wealth, if you have resources, a good pious, a good sincere, devout person will use those resources to honor God. That's what Mary does. I'd like for us to take a quick look at another woman who was pious. And yet she was pious as a poor woman. Mark chapter 12. In verse 41 of Mark chapter 12, now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrant. I like that. It's actually lends credence to those scholars who believe Mark was a gospel written for the Romans, but because they actually translate some money into Roman currency, like this, so you kind of understand. So we'll do our best at that. It's this widow's mite. It's the smallest amount of coin that you could get. Of all the different coins, whether they would be Greek, this was a Greek coin, whether it be any kind of Greek coin that had various values up to including silver and gold. This was a bronze coin. It was the smallest, the most insignificant amount of coin. And she had two of those, and those would enter, in this Roman currency. It's cheap. It's you couldn't even buy a pack of cigarettes with it. It's not a lot of money. And so it's real small amount of money. And it says this, it says, "Assuredly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who gave to the treasury." And it says they gave much. It said in verse 11, "And many who were rich put in much." And Jesus says, this woman put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For all they put in out of their abundance, what they had to spare, that's no sacrifice, what they had to spare out of their abundance. But she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had, her whole livelihood. It was all that she had, and yet she gave. Here's a pious person right here. We looked at Mary, we look at this widow woman, and people who say God comes first. We should be a pious people. But yet I believe that any of us in this room, if we were to be realistic, although we might look at our bank account and check our wallet and say, oh, I'm the pious one. No, we see it's not about how much money you got. It's about what comes first in your life. The desire for wealth is what these Sadducees had, and they rejected Christ for it. The rich young ruler is desired his lust for possessions. He rejected Christ for it. The Pharisees, who had a desire for admiration and to be exalted among the people, rejected the one who would not validate them. But we, as pious, sincere, devout people, we sacrifice our money, we sacrifice our pride, our ego, our own desires. We sacrifice it all, and whatever it may be that's needed to be sacrificed in us, that's the thing that Jesus says that he told the rich young ruler, you lack one thing. What is it? Some people won't give up their time. Whatever is in you that is resisting your walk with the Lord, you need to lay it up. You need to make that sacrifice. And I think this is a truth for us to observe here this morning. I think it's a truth. And I'm going to be reality. I'm going to do a little reality. I believe that what we're doing here is the work of Jesus. I don't know if you believe that or not. I'm thinking that maybe, and I'm going to tell you something, as a pastor, it's my responsibility, Joe's responsibility, that we speak the truth to you, even if you don't like it. And I can tell you that I know that we're living luxurious lives, but there's not much Mary or widow going in that offering, either one. There's not many people that are getting in and champion the financial needs that we have right here. And we don't speak a lot about money, but I'm not going to skip money, skip past it whenever there's an opportunity and a need for it to be declared from the Scriptures. I want to tell you something. This is a pious church, and we're a poor pious church. But if we believe in what Jesus is doing, then let's follow him in what he's doing here. And let's support it in every way we can. Support it with our resources, support it with our time, support it with whatever God has given us. Let's do that. But beyond our financial needs here and beyond your financial obligations, what is it in each of one of us that we can identify with that needs to change? Are we among the privileged? No, I'm not the wealthy. Yeah, some folks would call us wealthy with our sodas, cable TV, smartphones, TV, cigarettes, fancy clothes. What? How many pair of pants you got? Boy, ask some people in third world countries. Oh, yeah, we're living luxurious life. We are the privileged. What about the prestige? Are we among that? Are we really desiring to be accepted and admired? I'm going to tell you something. That can be a stumbling block, and it could be an offense to you and prevent you from walking with the Lord. Let's be a pious people who are devout, sincere. People who are content with necessities, not one to sacrifice needs for wants. Don't compare yourself to other people. If somebody in this fellowship right here has a deep pocket and they drive a fancy car or whatever, that's between them and God. That person, you don't know. They might be still giving and doing whatever God would have. It might be their time, it might be their money, it might be like Mary. They might have their priorities straight. We need to look at ourselves. We need to quit looking at other people. We looked at 3 categories because I believe we can fall into all 3 of them. Not to just look at other people, so that we can see where we fall. And I hope that we will put off this privileged, prestigious desire for a pious, sincere commitment to God. Won't you stand with me this morning?